Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Aswad, Metropolitan District's trustee. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation on critical return to work guidelines. First off, I'd like to thank our incredible district board and bank of officers. Our president this past year has been Dr. Ken Marsh, and our incoming president will be Dr. Anandi Pratap. Our secretary is Dr. Michael Putt, treasurer is Dr. Miriam Shamali, and our vice president is Dr. Adam Pallavi. A special note of appreciation goes out to Judy Quinslick of Crest Oral-B parent company is Procter & Gamble. We thank them for their generous donation to our district's Mask for Members initiative. She has also generously provided for 4 power brushes to be given out tonight. We will contact the winners by email at the end. Also, please check out dentalcare.com as they have hundreds of CEs available. In tonight's presentation, we have Don Schroeder, who's partner of Foley & Lardner, LLP. Don Schroeder is a partner and labor and employment attorney with Foley & Lardner. He has extensive trial experience in both state and federal courts, where he focuses on representing Fortune 500 clients on employment matters, including restrictive covenant litigation, wage and hour class actions, and single plaintiff discrimination cases. Don's trial experience includes a number of federal and state court jury trials involving claims under Title VII, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Discrimination in Employment Act, the Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Statute. Additionally, Don regularly handles traditional labor matters for clients, including union avoidance training, unfair labor practice proceedings, union elections, mass picketing, injunctions proceedings, labor arbitrations, and collective bargaining negotiations. And also will be joining him will be Summer Wiss. She's an associate at Foley & Lardner. Summer Wiss is an associate and litigation attorney with Foley & Lardner. She is a member of the firm's labor and employment and business litigation and dispute resolution practices. Now, I would like to welcome Don and Summer.
Hey, thanks, Paul. I'll just start off with a few caveats up front. First, I want to say thanks to the Metropolitan District Dental Society for having us. We are going to try to be an hour, power hour, so to speak, and perhaps you are already having a beverage of your choice to go along with this. It may actually help. A few caveats up front. First caveat, number one, I am not a dentist or doctor. And I don't have any form of medical degree. So to the extent that you guys have any kind of medical questions, you're going to have to reserve them for Paul or somebody else. In addition, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're undergoing right now, you should know that obviously I issue the COVID-19 caveat, which is anything changes any given day. And you probably know that from the CDC guidance that's been issued over the course of the last few days. And so, and I should say the last few weeks and months. And so one of the things that I think we want to do is make sure that you're able to view the slides. They're available to download on your own particular screen in order to view them. For some reason, we're having a technical glitch here, but I'm going to proceed through them. You'll be able to follow along as we go. And just a couple of caveats along the way, additional caveats. You have the ability to send us chats or questions along the way. What we're going to do is reserve some time at the end to go over Q&A, and we'll have them by email, and it'll be a little wonky to do it this way, but it's really the only way to do it. So start off. Coronavirus Resource Center, which is on page 2. Just so that everybody knows, we as a firm, we've probably got about 100 labor and employment lawyers nationally, 1,100 lawyers. We have put together a lot of guidance on coronavirus available as a resource center for all of you. Certainly just go up to Foley.com. You should be able to navigate it as going through the website. It's pretty simple, and to the extent that you need to download something, that should be fine. Jumping to the next page, operating in the changing regulatory environment. Obviously, there's been a lot of, well, here we have the slides again. This is great. I think we do. Let's see if we got this here. All right. I am just talking about the slides relating to the regulatory environment. All of you have probably figured out at this point that we are in an age where the CDC and OSHA are issuing guidance routinely on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. The CDC just came out with guidance on April 30th that, well, lo and behold, if you're asymptomatic, instead of the fact that you couldn't come back to work for 7 days, it's now 10 days. They issued guidance, I'm sure you know, on April 27th relating to dental settings. And then you've also got the overlay on top of that relating to OSHA guidance. With respect to our agenda, and this is the agenda we're going to try to run through between myself and Summer. I'm going to speak for the first part. Summer's going to speak for the second part, and then we're going to have Q&A at the end. Number one, we're going to talk about actions to create a safe workplace as you re-enter the work zone. We're then going to get into guidance for temperature testing. The third topic, PPE, always a favorite for everybody on this line, I'm sure. The CDC interim guidance, which Summer's going to go into detail about, and then 5 Q&A. Let me just say a few things up front about where we are in this process. Obviously, everybody's expecting and hoping and praying that we will be able to all go back to work in Massachusetts on the day after May 18th. I think the stay-at-home order is in place till May 18th, and the question will be, is it going to get extended or not? Regardless, I think everybody assumes that we will have reentry fairly soon. And reentry in this particular instance is kind of like that reentry that all of us have to deal with respect to our kids getting ready for back to school in August. You know, you have the checklist, you have all the supplies, you have the clothes, you have the books, all those things. And at this point, you should be thinking about all the things that you need to do in running a practice before your reentry. What does that entail? Well, the first thing it entails is making sure you're up on all the guidance, right? You have responsibilities to make sure that you maintain your dental practices in accordance with CDC and OSHA guidance, as well as anything coming out of the state and local level. But the second thing, and this is something that I think gets lost, is communication to patients and employees. You've got to show concern about their safety and health. You got to provide them a summary of steps that you've taken to comply with CDC guidance and OSHA guidance, and that you're engaging in best practices to make sure that the health and safety of your staff is maintained, as well as your patients. And then we slide into the next area of concern, which is, okay, after communicating about how you're going to do this reentry and what it's going to entail, you've got to get people to come back from furlough. I'm sure a lot of you have furloughed your employees, and they're now on unemployment. And, you know, the theme, I guess, is, the theme that comes out of Bill Belichick is the no days off. And I guess my theme that you're going to nudge your employees with is no summer off, because I think there's going to be a lot of employees that would actually like to take the summer off and stay on unemployment and collect the additional $600 a week for April, May, June, and July. You've got to understand the steps you need to take to make sure that your employees know your expectations about coming back to work, and that if they don't come back to work to a job that is substantially similar to the one that they had, if not identical, that is going to obviously jeopardize their ability to get unemployment in Massachusetts, because that'll be considered a voluntary quit. You obviously have to make it very clear as to why it is a voluntary quit and that you offered the job back to somebody. We'll get into that a little bit more. The next area, or the first area that we're going to step into, actions to create a safe workplace for employees and third parties. Obviously, that relates to your entire audience, which is patients that are coming in, your staff, your employees, etc. What do I mean here? Well, what do you need to do? Actions to create a safe workplace. First, you should be setting up a task force. Now, obviously, it depends on how big an audience you have, right? You need to understand what is going on with respect to the size of your workforce and whether or not you, in fact, need a task force of a couple people or just one or two. You got to analyze your operational needs, develop a plan for opening, reopening. It's almost, in some respects, much like when you may have started your practice, right? And really understanding those things. Communicating with your employees. What does that mean? Well, that obviously it means you've got to deal with the unemployment issue and letting them know that they need to come back to work. You may then have a scenario where you are dealing with a person who's got a health condition, and whether or not that health condition rises to the level of a disability under the ADA, which may entitle that person to a reasonable accommodation. The threshold issue, everybody always goes to the last question, which is there a reasonable accommodation to allow them certain rights inside of the workplace? The first question you always have to ask is whether or not the condition actually rises to the level of a disability. Is it a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity? Only then do you then get to the next question as to whether or not there is an issue of a qualified individual with a disability. Do they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activity? So that's a disability. Are they a qualified individual with a disability? Is there a reasonable accommodation that would allow them to perform the essential functions of the job? Now, things you also need to consider, whether or not you do a phased opening, identifying and obtaining supplies and equipment, the timing, the expectations, requirements. Obviously, everybody's dealt with the issues of PPE and what's going on in that regard. The issue here is making sure that you have those lines of supplies, because the supplies are actually much more than what you've had in your dental practice up until now. We're talking about face masks, we're talking about gloves, we're talking about face shields, we're talking about gowns. Well, you would have potentially had all of this kind of equipment in some regard. At this point, you really need to get to the point where you have a sufficient supply of PPE for a prolonged period of time. You also want to go over the training and documentation and planning that needs to be done for your entire workforce, because it really does start with your workforce and your staff and your employees. And I'm sure a lot of you have had longtime employees and you want to bring them back, but they also need to understand that while you may know all the rules and you are up on all the CDC guidance, at this point, they need to be as knowledgeable about what is required in a dental setting under CDC guidance, under OSHA's guidance, and preparing the workplace for a different setting than it was before. Now, reopening best practices. What are the things that you need to worry about there? Well, obviously you want to make sure that people follow their guidance. We should be on page 8 at this point page 7 of the, let's see here, if it comes up. Page 8, reopening best practices. For some reason, I'm not showing this on here, but reopening best practices are the slides that you should be on. Follow the CDC guidance and local government directives. Obviously, we went over the fact that those are things that you are going to need to go over with your workforce and make sure that you're up on. Physical distancing. We've obviously heard a lot about social distancing. And the problem is, well, okay, 6 feet, social distancing, that's what it should be, right? How is that possible in a dental practice? Well, obviously, it's extremely difficult. The goal really should be reducing congestion. Whether that's with the workplace layout, whether it's staggered or split shifts, and then restrictions on break times and congregating, and then limiting facility access. You need to understand that in looking at all of these issues, you're not just dealing there with the employees, but you're also dealing with the staff and the patients, right? And what you need to understand is we are going to have to do this re-entry not in one fell swoop with just a light switch, but that you are going to have to figure out how to create as much spacing as possible within the dental practice. And obviously I realize that dental offices have fairly narrow rooms to go from one patient to another. These aren't luxurious, wide open offices with big bay windows that somebody's looking out of, and we got lots of space. So I understand that you have to come up with the best way possible in order to maximize physical distancing, and that's by reducing congestion. Also, the issue of increased cleanliness and hygiene. There, you're talking about not just the things you need to do on a daily basis, just internally with respect to your own employees and what they need to do in terms of monitoring the workplace, daily cleaning of patient areas, but also, and you may have heard this phrase already, the deep clean. We've heard phrases like social distancing, phrases of 2020. Well, the other one I think that is apropos of 2020 is deep clean. And that means bringing in a cleaning service that does a deep clean of the office, whether that happens on a weekly basis, which a lot of employers are moving to, as opposed to a monthly basis. That seems to be the way of the future. You also want to make sure that you're going over all the hygiene tactics, practices that you're expecting people to abide by. With respect to patients, right? We've talked a good amount. It's the next slide, page 9 of our slides. And patients. Patient access should be phased in based on government instruction and necessity. Obviously, we've been talking about emergency dental practices up front. And at this point then, you need to understand, all right, what do we do with respect to patients that may or may not have some kind of symptoms? Well, patients should be subject to entry criteria, just like your own staff. So and that self-screening form that, through a list of questions that we would have for our own employees, and then also temperature checks, limiting the locations and personnel access, and then the unique record keeping and contact requirements. A couple of things that you need to be mindful of in this regard. And this comes down to, what do we do to ensure safe practices? Obviously, you should be telephone screening all your patients for signs or symptoms of respiratory illness. You want to make sure that you ask them to take their temperature before they come in. You should also be doing telephone triage of all patients in need of emergency dental care, and whether or not they've actually got issues that are critical that need to be done in a short time frame. Potential exposure guidance. Now, this is the next page. Even when screening patients for respiratory infections, you may treat a dental emergency patient who is later confirmed to have COVID-19. What should be the dental healthcare personnel, DHCP, should institute a policy to contact all patients who received emergency dental care in the dental setting 48 hours after they received emergency care. Well, why do we do that? We want to make sure that they don't have any symptoms of coronavirus and that they could spread it to anybody else. So you should be asking patients, not just before they come in to you, but also when they come, after they've been there, within the 48-hour period afterwards, to make sure that they haven't gotten sick. Why? Because all of you know at this point that this particular virus, there are a lot of people that are asymptomatic and or may not get sick for a couple of days, so they may be asymptomatic for a couple of days and then become symptomatic. Something else to be mindful of. There is also guidance, CDC's healthcare personnel with potential exposure guidance. We're going to go through some of that in detail. Moving to our next page, we have potential exposure guidance, correct? And then we've got move to the next page after that, and I'm just having a little bit of an issue with the, let's see here. So COVID-19 patient management, that's the next page. Patients with COVID-19 who have ended home isolation can receive emergency dental care. Now, I realize we're dealing right now with emergency dental care in this particular instance, and we really want to move to regular dental care. But first things first, emergency dental care. What do? Well, there's the non-test-based strategy. Somebody's got to be at least 3 days without a fever, improvement in respiratory symptoms, and at least 7 days have passed since the first symptoms have first appeared. That's the non-test-based strategy. The test-based strategy is persons who have COVID-19 who have symptoms, actually have them, but the fever's gone, there's an improvement in respiratory symptoms, and 2 negative test results. Persons with laboratory confirmed COVID-19 who have not had any symptoms, asymptomatic, at least 7 days have passed since the date of the first positive COVID-19 viral test and have had no subsequent illness. The 2 negative test threshold is a really difficult one, obviously, for people to understand. And so, because right now it's really hard to get tested. In fact, it's very difficult to get 1 test, never mind 2 tests. So that's the protocol that's been put in place by the CDC and what the expectations are there. Now, it doesn't just go to the issue of employees and patients. What about your delivery services and vendors? You want to identify the location for drop-off and pickup. You want to make sure that it's contactless delivery. Waive signatures when you can. Sanitary handling to avoid cross-contamination. These are all things that you need to start putting together. One thing that Summer and I have been working on for a number of our clients is the protocol. A protocol that is in place for what you're going to do on a daily basis and how you're going to deal with staff that may get sick, what you do for patients and whether or not they're sick, what kind of guidance you're supposed to follow in terms of the next topic, temperature testing. And that is the next area that you need to think about. If you go to the next page, which is guidance for temperature testing, we cite here exceptional times, and exceptional times means that this is very unusual that you're actually even allowed to engage in temperature testing. Why is that? Because under normal circumstances, the EEOC considers temperature testing of your people to be a medical exam, and the only way you could do that and do a medical exam is to be consistent with job related and consistent with business necessity. And so the EEOC puts a lot of restrictions on the ability to do temperature testing. However, it's the COVID-19 pandemic exception to the rule, and the exception is we can do temperature testing now. In fact, the CDC, OSHA, everybody expects us to be doing temperature testing of not just our employees, but also our patients. And so in this particular instance, you've got to decide, and it's not taking the temperature of the patients, you're just asking them to make sure that they've taken their temperature, if they can, before they come in. But you're still going to be asking them whether or not they've had their temperature, whether or not they have a temperature, and whether or not they have respiratory symptoms. That goes for patients. In terms of employees, what kind of temperature testing are you going to do? The expectation is that you'll use an infrared thermometer. Why that? Because it's contactless. You can do it without touching the skin. Now, you should have somebody who is actually able to do this kind of testing and do it in the right manner and have training on it. And so you want to make sure that there's one particular person, if possible, maybe two, that have training on it. Now, the temperature thresholds are different depending upon what laws you're looking at. The CDC says 100.4. The Mass Department of Public Health says 100. And so if somebody's got 100, they should be sent home to be quarantined, because the Mass Department of Public Health is actually a little bit lower than the CDC. Guidance for temperature testing. Well, this is an area that you need to think about, and a couple of things. Things that you should do and things you shouldn't do. Things you should do. Well, you should use a touchless thermometer. You should train the taker, so to speak, the person taking the temperatures. And then third, identify the threshold. Fourth, consider your record-keeping considerations, because the CDC has issued some guidance on this in terms of temperature logs and how you are going to maintain temperature logs for your employees. And there is a process and a form document that you can use for that. Now, what about the things you shouldn't be doing? Well, don't make individualized assessments. Obviously, you're going to have a threshold, it's 100. And so it's either either above 100 or below 100. And you really are not at that point doing any further diagnosis of somebody. You want to be discreet about whether or not they can stay there for work. I realize that a number of practices will be a lot smaller than other practices, but these are things you should be keeping in mind and try to be as discreet as possible. This is not the instance where you make individualized assessments, where you inquire as to additional conditions, or let somebody back without a release. Moving to the final topic before I turn it over to Summer is PPE. And these are just some considerations to think about. Selecting appropriate PPE based on OSHA risk of exposure. Obviously, if you've all read the CDC guidance on dental settings, you're in the very high exposure area, risk of exposure, dental healthcare personnel, DHCP. And so what 4 types of PPE do you have to have? Gowns, respirators or masks, goggles / face shields, and gloves. So all 4 PPE protections. And if you've seen any of the guidance on this, and we can go over it separately, but the expectation is when you are in direct patient care activities that you're going to use PPE, and that you're not going to use any kind of cloth masking or cloth face coverings, that you're actually going to use a respirator or face mask. And once again, this goes back to the planning that needs to happen for you to ensure that you have the proper amount of PPE at the end of the day. And This goes to some additional guidance that the CDC has given out, which is that dental facilities should provide the dental healthcare personnel with job-specific training on PPE. You've got to make sure that you've got the proper PPE available, but then also training your employees to make sure that they use it appropriately. With that, I'm going to turn over at this point to Summer, who's going to go into the CDC's interim guidance relating to dental healthcare personnel and what you do when you do have somebody that has a confirmed or suspected COVID-19 condition. So take it away.
Thanks, Don, and good evening, everyone. My name is Summer Wist, and I'm a labor and employment attorney at Foley & Lardner. And as Don just said, I'm going to be talking to you tonight about what to do when somebody in your dental practice either has confirmed COVID-19 or suspects that they do have COVID-19. And this is important to start thinking about now, just as it was, is to think about if patients have COVID-19, you also need to be thinking about if you or your staff get COVID-19 once we reopen and what to do in that event. So first, I think we should just start with the definition of dental healthcare personnel because it is quite broad. So the CDC defines DHCP as all paid and unpaid persons serving in dental healthcare settings who have the potential for direct or indirect exposure. And then they list a variety of things that could expose workers. But the point of me reading that to you is just to emphasize that dental healthcare personnel is a broad term and likely would cover everyone working in your dental practice, from the dentist to the front desk worker. So as we go through the next couple of slides, just keep that in mind that this interim guidance would likely apply to all of your employees. And then finally, before we start going through the specific criteria, I just want to mention that in Governor Baker's executive order that was first issued on March 23rd and then extended on March 31st, it does list dentists as an essential business and that dentists are healthcare providers. So in addition to the CDC guidance, we also have the Massachusetts executive order classifying dentists as healthcare providers, which is just something to keep in mind when you're looking at the CDC and other guidance that's coming out. So with that, let's start looking at what the criteria is to return to work if you have COVID-19 or suspect that you have COVID-19. So there are two main buckets that you're going to want to consider. The first is, does the employee have symptoms? And the second is if they're asymptomatic but know that they have COVID-19 because they've tested positive. And within those two buckets, there's going to be different criteria for when someone can return to work. So taking the first bucket, if you have symptoms, you're generally going to be looking at the time since the symptoms first appeared and the time since recovery when there are no longer symptoms. You also are going to have a test-based strategy for returning to work. The second bucket is if the person is tested positive, but they're asymptomatic. And there you're going to have two criteria as well, the time-based strategy and the test-based strategy. So we're going to go through each of these categories now in turn because the criteria does differ depending which category your employee falls into. So first, let's look at if your employee is symptomatic, so exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19, but they have not gotten tests. So this is the top left corner in the chart that we just looked at. So again, you're going to want to focus on the time since the symptoms appeared in that employee and then the time that's passed since they've recovered and had no symptoms. So the person can't come back to work until at least 3 days have passed since recovery, which is defined as resolution of a fever without the use of medicine and improvement in respiratory symptoms. In addition to that criteria, you also need to make sure that at least 10 days have passed since that employee first started exhibiting symptoms. So you need to make sure both of those prongs are met. And just a quick note on the symptoms. So for the criteria to return to work, it's focusing on respiratory symptoms. You may have noticed that in the end of April, the CDC came out with 6 new symptoms, and those are definitely helpful to keep in mind when you're considering if you have COVID-19 or might have COVID-19 and need to go get tested, but they're not included here in the criteria to return to work. You're really focusing only on the respiratory symptoms. And then just the last thing I'll note before we move on to the second bucket is that as Don mentioned earlier, it's now 10 days since symptoms first appeared. It used to be 7 days, but the CDC changed this guidance at the end of April. And they changed it because there's new evidence suggesting a longer duration of culturable viral shedding. And then the CDC did also caution that it may revise this again as additional evidence and information becomes available. So you just want to make sure that you're always checking the CDC's website, because the criteria for returning to work is also changing every day, and especially for healthcare personnel and dental healthcare personnel, they're going to be paying particular attention just because of the risk that those industries have. So make sure that you're always checking the CDC website. So now let's go to the second category. So now we're looking at the lower left-hand corner of the chart. So these criteria apply to an employee who is symptomatic and they're able to get tested. So this person can come back to work once their fever has resolved without the use of fever-reducing medicine, and again, their respiratory symptoms have improved. Here, though, they also need to have gotten 2 negative tests from at least 2 consecutive respiratory specimens collected at least 24 hours apart. So this test is obviously going to be harder to meet because of this 2 negative test requirement. The CDC recently removed language from this guidance that used to state that the test-based strategy here was preferred, but they removed that guidance. And they said that they removed it because of the extension from 7 to 10 days for the symptom-based return to work criteria that we just talked about, and also because I'm sure they recognize that getting 2 negative tests is going to be hard for any employee to do. So just keep that in mind. The CDC doesn't have a preference over which of these buckets you use for an employee exhibiting symptoms, and especially if people are not able to get 2 negative tests, then you should use the criteria on the previous slide that we just went over. The good thing about this criteria, though, is that you don't have the 3 days after the resolution of fever and improvement in respiratory symptoms. So if the person was able to get 2 negative tests, theoretically they could come back to work faster than if you use the criteria on the previous slide. So now let's turn to the third category. So now we're on the other column of the chart. So now your employee has COVID-19 and they know that because they've tested positive, but they don't have any symptoms. They're asymptomatic. So here, first we're going to look at the time-based strategy. So this employee isn't allowed to return to work until at least 10 days have passed since they got tested. And they need to have no symptoms that entire time. If they start exhibiting symptoms, then you need to go back to the first column and use the 2 slides that we just went over, either of those criteria. I think here it's important to note that the employee is only excluded from the workplace for 10 days, and they're asymptomatic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't transmit COVID-19 should they return to work. And so you want to make sure that if they return after 10 days, that they are outfitted with the correct PPE, because even if they're asymptomatic, they could still, be able to transmit the virus. But the CDC right now is only advising they stay out for 10 days. So they are certainly allowed to come back to work, but you just want to make sure you have appropriate PPE for them, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. Okay, so now let's turn to the last bucket. So this is going to be for the same, asymptomatic employee who tested positive. they can also return to work if they get 2 negative tests at least 24 hours apart. And again, what I was saying earlier about the preference for, the CDC used to have the preference for the test-based strategy. Well, they don't anymore because of the extension from the 7 to 10-day sit-out period. So again, here, it doesn't matter which criteria you're using. I mean, ideally, yes, you'd want your employee to have 2 negative tests, but understanding that that is not, possible or likely in a lot of cases. And I'll just note here, you'd be slightly less worried about this worker coming back because they would have had 2 negative tests, and that's a much better indication that they're no longer able to transmit COVID-19. But certainly you would still, want to make sure that you are providing PPE for them upon their return to the workplace, because there are specific criteria around that as well. And if they fell within any of those categories, which we're going to go over in a minute, you would want to make sure you had PPE available for them. And so those are the 4 main buckets of criteria to look at, depending if the person is symptomatic or not. And you need to make sure that the employee has met all of those criteria before they're allowed to return to the workplace. And as I said in the beginning, that would apply to everyone in your dental practice. Okay, so to conclude, before we do question and answers, because we have been getting a lot of great questions, I just want to go over quickly what happens when that person does return to the workplace. So everyone who is out of work because they either had COVID-19 or suspect that they did, when they return, they need to wear a face mask or source control at all times until their symptoms are completely resolved or they're back at their baseline. And back at their baseline would mean, if they had allergies or they always have a sore throat or something like that, that symptom wasn't new because of coronavirus, so they just need to get back to that baseline. And when the employee initially returns to work, they need PPE, so that, they'll need an actual face mask, not just a homemade cloth face covering, or source control during this time period until they're completely symptom-free. And, if they sit out for 10 days, we'd recommend that at least they're using PPE for the remaining 4 when they come back into the workplace, or at the very least, a mask of some sort. Once they are symptom-free or back to their baseline, you can go ahead and revert back to whatever policy you had previously regarding source control, so whatever the employee would have been doing before they went out of work. And then finally, I'll just note that, employees should always be self-monitoring for symptoms, and especially after they get coronavirus, you want to make sure that they continue to self-monitor. Resting at home for the 10-day period or however long it is, they might start feeling better, but returning to work, they might not be fully recovered, and those symptoms could exacerbate or, come back. So you want to just encourage employees to continue to self-monitor, even though, they felt fine one day and were able to come back into work. And, it's still a little bit unclear if you can get coronavirus twice. So, as the months go by, just keep that in mind and keep encouraging employees to continue to self-monitor and stay up to date with the latest CDC symptoms for coronavirus. And, those are the main considerations for what you should do if you or your employees get coronavirus or suspect that you have, coronavirus in your dental practices, and just things to be thinking about now so that you can plan ahead should that happen, and just communicate clearly to employees, the criteria specific to them that will enable them to return to work. And then, again, what would happen when they do return to work. And with that, I think we're going to open up the floor to some questions and answers.
Yeah, and thanks, Summer. That was great. I think we had some technical difficulties with the webinar, and when we're trying to also be mindful of answering your questions along the way, a lot of you have had some great questions. We've had member of our marketing team, Kayla Meister, who pulled together some of them for us. So what I'm going to do is, and we're at an hour mark or so right now on this line. It's about 45 minutes, though, that we've been going. I'm going to try to go over them, and Summer, why don't you and I just play off each other on this one? So the first one is patient's case scenario. Patient treated on Monday. Spouse calls us on Wednesday to inform that patient was diagnosed with COVID-19. What is my obligation as an employer to help ensure safety of my team? You want to take that one, and I'll take the next one.
Sure. So as Don kind of went over, you do want to make sure that you're following up with patients 48 hours after their appointment. So here, if the patient was treated on Monday and the spouse calls on Wednesday to inform you that the patient was diagnosed with COVID-19, that certainly is within that 48-hour window. So as an employer, you want to make sure that when patients come in, you're keeping, records of everyone they interact with in case a scenario like this does happen. So you would definitely want to, first isolate the room that the patient was in, make a list of everyone that they interacted with, staff and potentially other patients. Hopefully that wouldn't have happened, but, if it did, you would want to notify, the staff and all of those people that there was a potential exposure to someone who has confirmed COVID-19. And then as Don was saying, you would want to do a deep clean of your offices, just because somebody who had COVID-19 was recently in them, and you would want to do that immediately. And when you're communicating this to employees, you don't want to cause alarm. This is a situation that could definitely arise. And it's good that we're thinking about it now, because when it happens, you'll be prepared. You'll have the necessary supplies to clean, and you'll have, communications ready to notify other employees that this has potentially happened. And I'll just note finally that the CDC has also released the specific guidance for exposure, and you should be following that should this scenario arise after May 18th. All right, so turning to the second question, could you clarify if dentist offices are considered as essential or non-essential? Don, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, this goes to the order that came down on March 31, correct? That's the revised order. The first one, I think, was March 23rd, and dentist office are considered essential on that list of essential services.
Yep, and then similar to that question, the next question is, at the current time, CDC guidance is treat only emergencies and delay elective procedures. If on May 18th, the CDC guidance does not change, what is my liability as a business owner if there is litigation from a patient or staff member with regards to safety?
Well, this is one where this is a difficult one in the sense that because of this virus, there's no way of demonstrating that somebody necessarily got coronavirus from being in a particular setting. And so I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Summer, but you had not seen any case. I think the CDC said they had not seen any cases where people had been presumably infected in a dental practice. That is my recollection correct on that?
Yep, the CDC does drop that in a footnote, but I would just, caution with that the information we have right now isn't perfect. But yes, they did note that.
Right, and so is there liability? There's always potential liability, but that could be for any number of conditions, never mind coronavirus. But I think the likelihood of this is that we're expecting that May 18th the or the day after May 18th, that the governor's stay-at-home order will be lifted, and that that dental offices will be moving to trying to do things that are necessary, including additional procedures. There are a lot of procedures that are not necessary, quote unquote, elective procedures. You could actually make an argument that a lot of things that you have to go to a dentist for are actually necessary, as opposed to quote unquote elective procedures. But I think what you're going to see is hospitals like dental practices moving towards doing the elective surgeries and elective procedures. I think we're going to have more guidance. The guidance from the CDC has been coming out weekly, if not daily. So I think we're going to be seeing more guidance come out as people return to work. And I realize that that's a a non-answer, but it's the best we can say at this point. I don't think your liability goes up anymore. I think whether or not it's emergency versus elective procedure, I think the issue is whether or not you're maintaining safe practices in the workplace and following CDC and OSHA guidance. To close that one out. The next one, I had a meeting with staff yesterday, and a number of staff raised a concern about the safety of the practice and indicated that they are afraid to come back to work. In that case, do I need to hold their positions until they feel comfortable to come back to work? And I hire new employees to fill their positions. Currently, they are furloughed. I feel jeopardized because, quote, feel comfortable, end quote, is a subjective term. Thank you. Well, let me thank you. That's like 3 or 4 questions in one, but I'm going to let you try that one, Summer, and I'll finish it out.
Sure. So a lot of employees, obviously, now are scared of catching coronavirus and scared to go back into work. And they may refuse to return to work because they're receiving more money on unemployment. However, generally employees are not permitted to continue to collect unemployment if they refuse to come back to work. Having a, generalized fear of going back into the workplace is also not a valid reason to refuse to come back to work. A lot of this can hopefully be mitigated by good communication now before you reopen about all of the measures that you've put in place to ensure your employees that it will be safe to return to work. Unfortunately, people may still refuse, and if they do, you have a couple options. If you know that they're on unemployment, you will probably have the burden of making sure that they're no longer on unemployment. Usually you would get a list of employees who you used to employ who are claiming unemployment, and you can certainly contest that with the Massachusetts Department of Unemployment Assistance. If they refuse to come back to work, you should document, any requests that you make to them to come back to work and any refusal that they give to you. Hopefully you can get it in writing from them. And you can report that refusal to the state's unemployment agency so that they can also, investigate the matter and deny that person unemployment. Hopefully to avoid this situation. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. You finish the thought and I'll finish on top.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, hopefully this situation can be avoided by some of the measures we talked about earlier, setting up a task force, developing a clear plan for reopening, and just communicating well. But just know that a general feeling of uncomfortableness isn't going to be an excuse not to return to work when the workplaces do start reopening in Massachusetts.
Right. The next question, can the 48 post-appointment check be a text or should it be a phone call? It could be either one. There's no guidance on that. So that's an easy one. It could be either one. Next question. I had an office meeting today and a staff member was saying that the CDC does not have any guidelines for how dental offices should reopen. Is that correct? No, that's actually not correct. They do have CDC guidance that's out right now. with respect to the reopening and dental settings in particular. In fact, I know we were talking about this before summer, and I just want to make sure that I refer to it.
Yep. So on the CDC's website, kind of on the left-hand side, there are a bunch of drop-down menus. But if you go to healthcare, there is a drop-down menu for specifically for dental settings, and that really is the first place to start looking for guidance. And then that also links you to all of the applicable other CDC guidance for dental practices. But the heading of the webpage that you're looking for is dental settings. The next question is, does the CARES Act allow missing work due to child care issues? So no, the CARES Act doesn't, but the FFCRA does. So specifically the employee requesting leave would need to be caring for their son or daughter whose school or child care facility has been closed due to coronavirus. And that leave it can be the 10 days or the 80 hours of the expanded sick leave, and then it would be an additional 10 weeks of the expanded family and medical leave, totaling 12 weeks. And that would only apply to you the FFCRA only applies to you if you have under 500 employees. Right, Don?
Correct.
That was a lot of numbers.
Correct. One of the things, and this is a question that I don't have a good answer for this one, but it's a true issue. If you do give benefits under the FFCRA, there is a payroll tax credit that can be applied for purposes of people taking that leave. And so there is a mechanism for you to get a payroll tax credit in real time for the person when they are out on leave. I realize that doesn't answer the question of, with all these additional costs, how is a dental practice supposed to survive? I'm trying to point out one particular way. One particular way is taking the payroll tax credit for people that take leave under the FFCRA. Obviously, the issue of kids out of school, that's going to go on for, it looks like at least 6 more weeks for Massachusetts, maybe 7, where the kids are still supposed to be in school. So people would be able to, if they have kids that are under the age of 18, take leave during that time period. But you were able to get a payroll tax credit on the back end.
And we just had a great follow-up question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So the question is, are healthcare providers not exempt from the FFCRA? And that's actually a great question. So no is the quick answer. The longer answer is, under the FFCRA, healthcare workers and emergency responders can be exempt, but it's not a blanket exemption. It's an individualized exemption. So, it's not everyone that works for you is exempt. You really need to be looking at each individual employee and making that case-by-case assessment. And if you are doing that, just make sure you're doing it consistently in a non-discriminatory way.
That is a good question. And then the next question, for a pediatrician office, do we apply COVID-19 management rules to parents? Can we take a temperature of a parent? Well, one of the things that you should be mindful of is you could always ask to take the temperature of a parent, and whether or not they refuse or not. The infrared thermometer one, I just was at a client dealing with a Board of Health issue. It's pretty quick to take the infrared non-contact thermometer reading. There's nothing that prevents you from doing it, but, this goes back to making sure that you do things consistently across the board, and whether or not you ask everybody, and not just, one person in particular. The big issue is asking the whether or not the kids have been sick and whether or not they've got any symptoms, and certainly you're going to be asking that of the parent, as well, in that vein. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that particular answer.
No, that sounded good. I mean, I think the other thing that, just to be mindful of, the more people coming into the practice, just make sure you are keeping some type of documentation of that in case you had a situation where you did need to contact people after they, attended their appointment and left. And in this scenario, that would also include the parent. So the next question is, data suggests 14 days at least post-infection. Patients have been shown to shed virus for over 14 days post-infection. And is just asking, why are we not following this? And, why does the CDC guidance differ? And I guess I would, in response to this, I would just say that the CDC guidance is really a floor. So right now it is a 10-day sit out, but if you wanted to make it 14 days for your employees to return to work, you certainly could. I would just caution that if you did do that and then subsequently wanted to drop it back down to, 10 days or however many days the CDC, may subsequently set the threshold at, that would be hard to communicate to employees. So it's probably the safest bet to just go with the criteria that the CDC has set forth, currently, that I went over earlier, even though, yes, the 14 days kind of has been the messaging we've been getting.
Yeah, there's another question
Donna.
that's actually something that just came in. No, I think you answered that correct. The problem is the CDC's been all over the place with their guidance on this, and in an ideal world, everybody would be tested, right? It's extremely difficult to get tested. I know that everybody seems to know that, at least in Massachusetts, and the likelihood of getting getting two tests in a very short time period seems very difficult to do. And so just so that we're giving you the best practical advice given the circumstances and what they are, and the fact that there are, in some places, the answers are gray and not black or white. What if an employee refuses to come back to work? What paperwork does the practice need to have? Well, this is, there's no requirement, but here's the deal. If you're going to go to the Division of Unemployment and contest unemployment benefits for somebody that would not come back to work because either they didn't feel comfortable or they just liked being on unemployment, you need to send them an email or a letter, something in writing, memorializing the fact that you'd offered them their previous job, either identical or substantially similar, and that they refused it. And then if they don't respond to that, well, that's your paperwork. It doesn't need to be, anything highfalutin. It's just something that acknowledges in writing, memorializes that they refused the job. Next question. What liability is present, patient abandonment, if a patient refuses screening, temperature testing, following guidelines that are set? I think that you have less liability there if the patient refuses to follow the guidelines, and you're going to be able to establish that you're using these guidelines for everyone. And so I think your liability is much less than if you allowed a patient to do whatever they wanted and to refuse to be screened or to follow the guidelines that are in place. And so that's how I would look at it. It's a sliding scale of potential liability. What kind of release are we allowed to ask for when accepting an employee back for work if they are sick? You want to go over that one,
Sure. So I think, generally if an employee has COVID-19 or suspected COVID-19 and they are out of work, before they returned, you'd want to make sure that they met all of their criteria. And in terms of documentation, it would be smart to get a return to work certification, which is, a one-page document that kind of lays out the criteria that individual employee will need to meet before they can return to work, and then just have them, sign and certify that document stating that they have met all of those criteria. And that would just, the form would vary based on which kind of bucket or category they fell within, depending if they were symptomatic or asymptomatic, and if they were able to get 2 negative tests or not, which is what we went over earlier. But I think it is advisable to get some type of certification when that employee does come back to work, stating they met their criteria to return. The
Before
next
returning
question
to work,
is,
go ahead. I was going to say I'll do it. Before returning to work, can we ask personnel to take the COVID test? Which one should you recumbent, antibodies or virus? Well, it's really difficult right now to get the antibodies test. I'm not even aware of anybody that's gotten that test. Can you ask personnel to take the COVID test? Yeah, I think that's perfectly appropriate. But if you're going to ask them, then you would want to tell everybody to do it. The problem right now is that unless, and perhaps because they work in a healthcare setting, a dental practice, that they have a better ability to get one at this point, but they'd have to get, obviously, right now, a note from their physician for purposes of qualifying for a COVID test. But it's perfectly appropriate to ask your personnel to get a COVID test. Next question.
So then,
yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Since we create aerosols, do we need to have front desk staff wear respirators? Does it matter how far away they are from patient care? So this is a tricky question because it will kind of depend based on everyone's own office layout. But, generally during the actual aerosol generating procedure, yes, you need an N95 respirator as protection. However, the front desk staff likely aren't in the room when that procedure is happening, and so they wouldn't need that type of protection. And just given the availability of PPE right now, it's probably not feasible for the front desk staff to be wearing N95 masks all of the time. You would want them to certainly be wearing, a cloth face covering or, the next best available mask that you could provide them, a surgical mask or something along those lines. And then certainly if they're not far enough away from patient care, short of giving them an N95 mask, you could, install a plastic barrier between them and the patient waiting room, which I'm sure you guys have seen at, CVS or the grocery store now, something like that. Like a physical barrier could help if they couldn't physically distance from the patient care waiting room or, whatever it was in your specific office.
And the last question before I turn it back over to Paul is, what if my staff cannot come back to work full time as they have children and they have no child care? Can they still file for unemployment? Well, assuming that the child care is available otherwise, so not because of the pandemic, and I know the governor's giving guidance for how long the stay-at-home order would last for child care. I think it's through the end of June. Say it's after that time period. Well, what would be the excuse for that person if they work full-time and they had children and they just don't have child care? Well, that wouldn't be an excuse for filing unemployment. However, up until the time when the kids are out of school because of the pandemic, or child care facilities are not available because of the pandemic, so assuming those two scenarios, they would be able to potentially get FFCRA leave and qualify for that with you at the dental practice, assuming there's not an exemption. And then on the flip side, you'd be able to take a payroll tax credit. That's the short answer to a pretty detailed question. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul. I want to just thank everybody for hanging in there, realizing that the slides were sometimes difficult to follow on this particular program, but everybody should have the ability to download them, and certainly you know how to get a hold of us if you have any additional questions. But I'll turn it back over to Paul at this point.
John, Summer, thanks a lot for a great presentation. This is such a moving target for you guys to shed some light on this. I'd also like to announce that we can give out some CEUs tonight. If you email DSLaw2020 to mddsboard@gmail.com. Again, email DSLaw2020 to our email site, mddsboard@gmail.com. And also a big thank you for other sponsors for our Masks for Members program, from Randy Fine, Insurance Specialist, Andrew Schwartz, CPA, and Ira Dickerman's Lab. They've all been very generous to help support our initiative for getting some masks out to membership of Metropolitan. Again, Dawn and Summer, thank you very much for this presentation, and everyone be safe. Thank you.